The patrol had been quiet and routine for the past 12 hours. Captain Henry Waitrose stood on the bridge of the UEES Cerberus, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the holographic map of their sector. The ship's AI tracked the usual flow of interstellar traffic, freighters, diplomatic envoys and independent traders, all moving through designated lanes under the watchful eye of the United Earth Defence Fleet. Predictable, unchanging, until it wasn't. "Sir," Lieutenant Kim Carbonell called from the sensor station, her tone crisp with urgency. "We've got an unknown vessel moving off route, 20,000 clicks from trade lane Theta 7. Waitrose turned. Type? Medium hull freighter. Old Corellian model. No registered flight plan. No response to automated pings. A freighter drifting off course wasn't necessarily a red flag, but something about the pattern felt wrong. Most traders stuck to the designated corridors, unless they were smuggling or trying to avoid customs. And smugglers usually had the sense to keep their heads down, not meander into a military patrol zone. Waitrose straightened. "Helm, bring us into visual range. Keep it quiet." The Cerberus engines rumbled softly as the ship adjusted its trajectory. Tactical overlays lit up on the main display, feeding real-time telemetry as they closed the distance. The unknown vessel was moving sluggishly, as if hesitating. "Still no response?" Waitrose asked. Carbonell shook her head. "They're ignoring us, or pretending to." "Get a boarding team ready," Waitrose ordered. "I want a full inspection." Within minutes, the ship's hangar was a flurry of movement. Marines suited up. Weapons checked. Comms tested. Waitrose watched from the observation deck as Commander Douglas Furlan, a veteran of more combat deployments than he cared to count, ran final checks on his team. Furlan stepped onto the drop shuttle last, slapping the release on the bulkhead door. "We'll knock," he said over the comms. "Let's see if they answer." The shuttle detached smoothly, thrusters flaring as it cut through the void. The freighter loomed ahead, old, battle-scarred, its hull patched in places where energy bolts had clearly struck. At some point, it had seen combat. As the shuttle closed in, the freighter's engines suddenly flared to life. "They're running!" Carbonell barked. "Power spike, charging their FTL." Waitrose was already moving. "Shut them down!" The Cerberus fired a timed graviton pulse. The shockwave rippled through space, collapsing the FTL field before it could fully form. The freighter bucked violently, its engine sputtering out. "Target disabled," Carbonell confirmed. "They're dead in the water." "Board them," Waitrose ordered. The shuttle latched onto the hull of the crippled freighter, its docking clamps hissing as they secured the airlock. The Marines moved fast, entering the ship in a flawless, coordinated maneuver. Inside, the ship was a mess. Dim lighting, the air thick with the stench of sweat, rust, and something worse. The corridors were narrow, lined with exposed piping and makeshift barricades. It wasn't a freighter, it was a prison. Furlan's voice came through the comms, low and tense. "Captain, you're going to want to see this?" Waitrose didn't wait. Within minutes, he was stepping into the ship, flanked by 2 armed Marines. The moment he saw the interior, his stomach turned. Rows of makeshift cells lined the cargo hold, packed with gaunt figures from countless species. The prisoners huddled in rusted cages, the air thick with the stench of confinement. Some barely reacted as the Marines entered, too drained to respond. Others flinched, their bodies instinctively recoiling. Waitrose stepped deeper into the hold, his pace slowing as the full scope of the horror sank in. His stomach twisted, but he kept moving, his jaw clenched. Then he locked eyes with a Corellian, skeletal and trembling, its gaze pleading yet resigned. The Corellian's translucent skin barely clung to its frame, revealing the dark veins that pulsed sluggishly beneath. 2 lidless eyes, too large for its sunken face, reflected the dim emergency lighting. Its elongated fingers, tipped with what once were sharp claws, now trembled, dulled by starvation. "How long have you been here?" Watros asked. The alien swallowed hard, lips cracked from dehydration. Too long. Watros turned to Furlan. Get these people out of here, now. The Marines moved quickly, cutting through cell locks and guiding the prisoners toward the docking bay. Some were too weak to walk. Medics were already moving to stabilize them. A deep mechanical groan reverberated through the ship the moment the Marines breached the corridor leading to the control station. "They're sealing us in," one of the Marines snapped. Furlan didn't slow. He motioned towards Sergeant Weiss, who was already priming breaching charges. A sharp crackle erupted over the comms, alien voices barking frantic orders. Then the ship jolted. The lights flickered, replaced by the eerie red glow of emergency luminescence. "They just vented atmosphere in sections 3 and 4, Carbonell reported. "They're trying to kill us, or slow us down. Either way, they're not going." "Quietly, then we return the favour," Furlan growled. With a controlled detonation, the breaching charge blasted the corridor open. The Marines surged forward, weapons raised, cutting through the smoke. The first shots came from behind cover, short, desperate bursts of plasma fire. The Nets crew wasn't a military force, but they fought like cornered predators. One of the pirates lunged at a Marine, a jagged blade in hand. The soldier sidestepped, driving the butt of his rifle into the alien skull, dropping him instantly. Another rushed toward the control panel, fingers scrambling over the console. "Stop him!" Furlan barked. Before the pirate could finish his command, a single round punched through his chest. The alien crumpled against the controls, its segmented insectoid limbs twitching as a thick, dark ichor seeped from the wound. Its second pair of smaller, vestigial arms spasmed before curling inward, the last desperate reflex of a species not accustomed to dying so easily. Then it went still. With their last line of resistance shattered, the remaining crew dropped their weapons, some pressing their hands together in desperate surrender. One, still on his knees, spat at the floor, his lips curled in a sneer, if it could even be called lips. The creature's split mandibles flexed, revealing serrated inner ridges clicking together in a sound eerily reminiscent of grinding bone. Dark chitinous plates ran down the length of its body, layered like crude armour, and the slits where its nose should have been flared in contempt. "You shouldn't have interfered, human." Furlan didn't respond. He just hauled the alien to his feet and shoved him toward the exit. "Captain?" Carbonell's voice crackled over the comms. "You need to see this." Watros strode to the ship's bridge. Carbonell stood over the command console, a data slate in hand. "Manifest logs," she said, handing it to him. Watros scanned the files, his expression darkening with each line, the cargo lists, the destinations, the sheer scale of the operation. "This isn't an isolated case," he muttered. "They've been running this route for months." Carbonell nodded. "And there's more. Some of the prisoners told us they were taken from colony outposts. We're not talking about isolated kidnappings. Whole settlements have vanished." Watros's grip tightened on the slate. "Enough." He turned back to the prisoners, now being escorted into the Cerberus's hangar bay. They weren't just cargo, they were proof. "Patch me through to UED command," he ordered. "Now." The transmission went live, Admiral Lance Segal appearing on the bridge's main display. His expression hardened as Watros relayed what they had found. "This isn't just some backwater crime ring," Watros finished. "This is organized, coordinated, and it's happening on our watch." Segal exhaled slowly, his gaze hardening. "We need to take this to the Council." Watros held his breath. "And if they refuse to act?" Segal stared at the screen for a long second, then spoke, his voice steady. "Firm, then we will." Captain Henry Waitress stood rigid, arms crossed, as the transmission line to UED command closed. The words of Admiral Segal still echoed in his mind. "We need to take this to the Council." He clenched his fists, tension radiating through his stance. A formal approach, a diplomatic request. He knew how this would go. The prisoners, now under medical supervision in the ship's lower decks, had yet to speak in full detail, but the fragmented accounts were enough. Some had been taken from isolated colonies, others had been bought and sold like livestock. And there were hundreds of them. That was what twisted in his gut. This wasn't the work of a rogue operation. This was systematic. "Captain," Carbonell's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "We just finished analysing the freighter's database. It's not just a freighter, Captain. It's a supply chain." Watrous exhaled slowly. "Go on." Carbonell tapped the interface, bringing up the manifest logs on the main display. A sequence of names, species, coordinates. The data stretched for pages. "This is a route map," she said, voice tight. "A routine. This freighter wasn't just a transport, it was part of a supply chain. Someone out there is managing these routes, coordinating them like trade shipments." She glanced at him. "Except they aren't moving cargo. They're moving people." Watrous stared at the screen. "Anything on their destination?" "Not conclusive. The last transmission from their nav system was encrypted before we boarded, but we pulled a list of past drop points. A series of systems and outposts lit up on the holographic map. The pattern was clear. All were far beyond central trade lanes, on the outskirts of known space. Some were abandoned mining colonies, others were frontier worlds struggling to maintain self-sufficiency. Carbonell crossed her arms. "If I had to guess, I'd say this is just a fraction of the real network." Watrous didn't respond immediately. He turned back to the display, feeling the slow burn of frustration settle in. "We will send this to the Council," he said finally. "No interpretations, no assumptions, just facts." He tapped his comm. "Bridge to Sagal." A moment later, the Admiral's face reappeared on the display. "We have everything," Watrous said. "Records, coordinates, survivor testimonies. It's all being transmitted to you now." "Acknowledged," Sagal replied. "I'll personally push this through to the Council. Sit tight, Captain." The screen darkened. Now they waited. 12 hours had passed and the UEES Cerberus drifted in silence. Watrous stood at the viewport, jaw clenched, staring into the unchanging void. No orders, no movement, just waiting. Below, the hum of medbay and quiet murmurs filled the lower decks as doctors worked tirelessly. The rescued survivors lay in recovery, some restless, others motionless, all caught in the weight of what came next. The crew moved with quiet tension. No idle chatter, no wasted steps. They were all waiting, waiting for a decision, waiting to see what these lives were worth. A chime from the comms console broke the tension. Watrous turned. "Council session is starting," Carbonell said, voice tight. Watrous exhaled. "Connect it. Let's see if they do the right thing." On the Galactic Council station, the chamber was a testament to order and power. Rows of towering figures from various species lined the elevated platforms, each representative an entity of influence. At the centre, standing before the Assembly, led Councillor-Chancellor Michael Laney, humanity's appointed delegate. He gestured toward the central display as a transmission link activated. The holographic form of Admiral Lance Sagal materialized, broadcasting live from UED Command. He sat rigid in his chair, expression unreadable, as the recorded evidence played. The images spoke for themselves. The prisoners, the route logs, the intercepted communications from the captured freighter. As the last recording faded, a long silence filled the chamber. Then a Vashari representative, his scaled fingers laced together, leaned forward. His elongated reptilian face remained unreadable, but the slow flick of his forked tongue hinted at contemplation. The faint bioluminescent markings along his brow pulsed subtly, a sign of either intrigue or irritation. Hard to tell with his kind. "This is troubling," he said. "More than troubling," Sagal's voice cut through the chamber, firm even through the transmission. This is proof that a large-scale trafficking operation is running unchecked across the outer systems. We need immediate intervention. A ripple of murmurs spread through the chamber. Another council member, a feline like Zari, hissed through her sharp teeth. "Admiral, we have received similar reports before, unverified, speculative." Sagal narrowed his eyes. "And now we have verification." More silence. Finally, a deep-voiced Gavar representative leaned forward, his heavy, armour-plated form unmoving. "The Council will consider this matter." Sagal's expression hardened. "Consider? How long?" "As long as necessary." Sagal forced himself to remain composed. "We don't have that luxury. This operation is active. People are suffering right now." A Tran delegate, her pale, translucent skin shifting with agitation, gestured vaguely. "Admiral, with all due respect, we cannot simply deploy forces every time a localized problem arises in fringe sectors. The political ramifications alone—" "Localized problem?" Sagal snapped. "This isn't localized. This isn't speculation. It's happening right now. And you're sitting here talking about ramifications?" A thin, avian-like Kasari representative clicked his beak, tilting his head. "Admiral, I must remind you that direct military action falls under Council jurisdiction. No civilization can act unilaterally in such matters." Sagal's jaw tensed. He knew exactly what this was. Stalling, bureaucracy, politics. "How many more do you need?" he asked, voice low. "How many more reports before you act?" The Kasari's feathers ruffled slightly. "The Council will review the data and determine the best course of action." Sagal had heard enough. He let the silence linger for a moment, scanning the room through the transmission, letting his eyes settle on each delegate who had just decided to let slavery continue. He exhaled slowly. "Right." The holographic feed flickered slightly as he shifted in his chair. "If the Council isn't prepared to act," he said, voice like iron, "then we will." "You cannot act without approval," the Trenian delegate protested. Sagal's expression didn't change. He didn't need to say anything else. Without another word, the transmission cut off, leaving the chamber in tense silence. Watros sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, as the live feed of the Council session flickered out. The silence was heavy. "They're stalling," Carbonell said, breaking it first. Furlon leaned forward, his voice tight. "We knew it was coming, but hearing them say it out loud—" He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "It doesn't make sense," Weiss muttered. "They have nothing to lose by intervening, unless—" He trailed off. Carbonell's expression darkened. "Unless some of them are benefiting from this—" No one spoke for a moment. Then Watros did. It wouldn't be the first time. Furlon's hands curled into fists. "So what now?" "We sit here while the Council reviews the suffering of entire colonies." Watros straightened. "No." The officers turned to him. "We're not waiting," he said, voice firm. "Get the ships ready." Furlon's brow furrowed. "Ready for what?" Watros met his gaze. "For war." A beat of silence. Then Carbonell's terminal pinged. She glanced at the screen, eyes widening. "Sir," she said, voice tight, "we just received a new—" "Transmission." Watros turned to her. "From who?" Carbonell hesitated. "From a fringe colony, an outpost in the Vyar system." Watros turned to her. "What do they have?" Carbonell swallowed. "They found human prisoners among the captured." Weiss growled. "You're sure?" She nodded. "Visual confirmation. They sent images, logs." She worked quickly over the interface, pulling up the encrypted report. The holo display flickered, and then a grainy image appeared. A holding cell. Emaciated figures huddled together in the dim lighting. Among them, distinct human faces, gaunt, bruised, but unmistakably human. Weiss cursed under his breath. Furlon clenched his fists. Watros's jaw locked. "How many?" At least 24 identified so far, likely more. They're being moved between colonies, same as the others. Carbonell exhaled. Sir, some of them were taken from registered UED outposts. These aren't civilians who wandered off course. These are our people. The weight of it hit like a hammer. The net wasn't just preying on alien fringe colonies. They were taking humans. Fon broke the silence. This only confirms it. We're at war. Watros didn't hesitate. Send it to UED Command. Now. Aboard the UED Command Centre, Admiral Lance Segal stood rigid in his private briefing room, arms folded as he stared at the incoming transmission from the UEES Cerberus. The moment the call connected, Captain Watros's face filled the display, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carried the weight of what he had just uncovered. "Captain," Segal greeted, his voice even. "Report." Watros wasted no time. "Sir, we've received confirmation from a fringe colony in the Via system. Human prisoners have been found among the captured, not civilians lost in deep space. Registered UED personnel." Segal didn't blink. "Send me everything." Carbonell transmitted the data immediately. Segal's display flickered as the files came through. He scanned the images, stopping as his gaze locked on bruised human faces, barely recognizable in the shadowed confines of alien slave cells. He inhaled slowly, suppressing the burning rage in his chest. Watros broke the silence. "Sir, what are our orders?" Segal exhaled sharply, his jaw tight as steel. "Hold position. Get your ship and your people ready." His eyes darkened. "Enough talk. It's time to move." The transmission cut. Watros sat back, shoulders tense as the weight of inevitability settled over the bridge. Whatever hesitation may have existed before was now gone. The UED was going to war. Segal turned away from the display and opened a secure communication line to Chancellor Michael Lehner aboard the Galactic Council station. The Chancellor's image materialized, his brow furrowed. "Admiral, I assume this is urgent?" Segal didn't bother with pleasantries. "We've confirmed human prisoners among the captured. We have the evidence." Lehner's face barely shifted, but Segal saw it, the flicker of understanding in his eyes. Segal's voice was calm, but firm. "We cannot wait for the Council to deliberate any longer. We cannot trust them to act." A heavy pause. Then Segal straightened, his voice like cold iron. "We cannot wait any more. This has left their hands. This is our problem now." The transmission ended. Lehner didn't argue. He didn't try to dissuade him, because he knew there was nothing to say. Segal didn't hesitate. He pivoted, tapping into the secured UED High Command frequency, pulling in the most critical leaders of Earth's fleet. One by one, their faces appeared on the holo display: admirals, fleet commanders, tactical chiefs. This was not a diplomatic gathering. This was a war council. Hardened strategists who had spent their lives securing humanity's survival in a hostile galaxy. Segal wasted no time. A few words were all it took. "Human prisoners have been taken as slaves." His voice carried through the channel like a blade through steel. "The Council has refused to act. It's our problem now, and we always solve our problems." A murmur of grim acknowledgement spread through the officers. No hesitation, no doubts. Segal continued. "We mobilize immediately. I want battle groups repositioned to key strategic points across the outer systems. We strike hard and fast. No half measures." One of the admirals spoke, his voice laced with cold fury. "Do we have allies?" Segal's gaze darkened. "We will, or we'll do it alone." Without another word, he tapped another control, opening encrypted channels to select alien factions, civilizations who had been watching from the sidelines, suffering under the same neglect from the Council, but lacking the strength to oppose it alone. The messages were simple: private, director. We know you've suffered losses. We know the Council has abandoned you. Stand with us, fight with us, and we will end this together." Seagal turned back to his officers, his gaze sharp. "This isn't a police action. It's not containment. This is eradication. We will finish this." His tone was firm, leaving no room for doubt. "You have your orders. We move within the next cycle." The feed cut. The war had begun. The response came faster than expected. Within hours of the UED's encrypted outreach, transmissions from multiple species confirmed their participation in the assault. The Vashari coalition, long known for their neutrality, sent a terse but unmistakable response. "We will fight." The Tari Compact, a nomadic race of starfarers who had suffered under the net's raids for decades, pledged a fleet of fire-fast attack vessels. The Drari warlords, infamous for their distrust of centralized power, sent only a short message. "We remember those taken. We will be there." One by one, names that had never stood together on a battlefield aligned. At UED command, Admiral Lance Seagal observed the incoming confirmations. There was no triumph, only necessity. He turned to his officers. "We hold a war council in 1 hour," he said. "Get me every fleet leader who has answered the call. We move fast." The moment the first allies responded, UED intelligence began exchanging data, trade manifests, intercepted transmissions, navigational patterns. Within hours, the truth became undeniable. The net had never been in hiding. It had thrived in plain sight, shielded by the Council's apathy. Sifting through reports, analysts triangulated the enemy's core stronghold with unsettling ease. The YX system, an isolated cluster of dying stars outside established trade lanes, officially unremarkable, yet constantly visited by freighters with no registered origins. It was no hidden fortress. It was a factory, a marketplace built on stolen lives. Once the enemy's location was confirmed, there was no hesitation. Orders were sent, warships were called to action, and the War Council convened. Aboard the UED Scourge, a behemoth-class dreadnought designed for planetary siege warfare, there was no doubt now. The assembled commanders met through secure hololinks, some seated in UED battlecruisers, others standing aboard dimly lit warships, their alien forms flickering through the transmission. Seagal's gaze swept over them. Warriors, tacticians, survivors of conflicts fought beyond the edges of human maps. This was not a place for diplomacy. It was a gathering of those who knew action was the only language left. He activated the central display. A holographic projection of the net's stronghold spun before them. "The net believes itself untouchable," he said. "They are wrong." His fingers moved over the controls, highlighting strategic points. "We divide this operation into 2 objectives." He gestured toward the enemy's heart. "The UED fleet strikes the net's headquarters. Total destruction. No negotiation." The holomap expanded outward. "Our allies will launch simultaneous strikes on the net's outposts, prison colonies, supply depots and command relays, aiming to free all the victims. We cannot allow them to regroup or escape. Any stronghold that does not surrender immediately will be wiped from the stars." A Tal'Eri captain, his translucent skin reflecting the blue glow of his console, folded his arms. "This will be a multi-system engagement. We need absolute coordination. One misstep and they scatter." Seagal nodded. "We don't have the luxury of perfection. We move fast, we hit hard, and we do not stop until the net is erased." A murmur of agreement spread across the comms. A Drari warlord, his heavy-scaled form shadowed by the dim light of his war bridge, leaned forward. "And the Council?" His deep voice rumbled through the channel. "They will not let this pass unnoticed." Seagal's jaw clenched. "By the time they react, we will already be committed. If they want to stop us, they'll have to decide whether they're willing to fight for slavers." The silence that followed was heavy. A Vashari admiral, her smooth-scaled face impassive, finally spoke. "Then we strike at the next strategic window." Sargal's response was immediate. Number, "We strike now." In the heart of the Galactic Council station, an uneasy silence lingered. Power was shifting, and they all knew it. The air carried a nervous weight, the kind that came when powerful people realized they were no longer in control. A low-ranking bureaucrat, a thin-frame Vanna with violet skin and sunken eyes, whispered to his superior. "There is movement," he said, voice barely above a breath. "The humans, they're mobilizing." The Kasari delegate, the same one who had dismissed Sargal's demands, stiffened. Mobilizing for what? A deep, hollow pause. The Vanna swallowed hard. War. Murmurs spread through the chamber. Some looked to one another seeking confirmation. Others immediately turned their gazes to Chancellor Michael Lehner. He sat at the central platform, composed but unmoving, his expression unreadable. The feline-like Zari councillor narrowed her eyes at him. "Chancellor," she said, voice smooth but pointed, "I assume your government has informed you of this?" Lehner met her gaze evenly. "It appears I am learning of it just as you are." A scoff. "Impossible," the Gavar representative rumbled. "You cannot expect us to believe the UED has begun a military campaign without consulting its own government." Lehner tilted his head slightly, his hands folding before him. "You assume the UED considers this a campaign," he said, voice measured. "Perhaps you are mistaken." The council chamber stirred uneasily. A Tran diplomat, her translucent skin shifting in pulses of unease, leaned forward. "You knew this was coming," she accused. "You let them act." Lena's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I do not control the UED," he said simply, "just as you do not control the fleets of your own people." Silence. Because it was true. The Council had long prided itself on governance through deliberation, on its ability to persuade rather than dictate. And now, for the first time in centuries, they had no leverage. The humans weren't asking for permission. They had already decided. The Kasari delegate drew a measured breath. "Then tell us, Chancellor," he said, feathers ruffling slightly. "Do you support this?" Lena's gaze swept over the chamber, taking in the shifting expressions, the uncertainty, the flickers of unspoken calculations. And then, finally, he spoke. "As a representative of humanity, I will say this." His voice was steady, resolute. "The UED does not start fights," his expression hardened, "but we end them." No one spoke after that. Back to the war room. Within hours of the War Council, the largest UED fleet ever assembled outside of Seoul had begun moving toward the YX system. Coordinated through secured FTL relays, battle groups repositioned across the outer colonies, assembling at pre-designated jump points. Admiral Lance Sargal had chosen to lead the attack personally, aboard the UED battleship Scourge. The fleet under his command was a hammer, meant to break the net in one decisive strike. Fleets from their alien allies had also begun their own synchronized assaults, hitting supply routes, intercepting trafficker ships, and disrupting every logistical artery the net had relied on. The operation had already begun. Now it was time to finish it. Sargal's fleet reached the final approach. The YX system lay ahead, its central star a dying ember, surrounded by drifting debris, a collection of moons. And there, in the distance, was their target. A massive orbital station bristling with defense platforms and surrounded by what should have been a disorganized flotilla of scavenger ships and repurposed freighters. It should have been an easy assault. Sargal stood on the Scourge's bridge, hands clasped behind his back, watching as UED warships slipped into attack formation. The first wave of fighters launched, sweeping forward to engage. Aboard the UED Cerberus, Captain Watt's voice came over the fleet-wide communication. Enemy response is slower than expected. They're scrambling their defences. Seagal's brow furrowed. It was too easy. Maintain formation, he ordered. Prepare for primary bombard. The trap snapped shut. From the far side of YX's second moon, ships burst from the shadows, dozens of them emerging in a coordinated wave. Not salvage freighters, not disorganized pirates. Warships, heavy cruisers, sleek interceptors, dreadnoughts, painted in the deep crimson sigil of the net. They had been waiting. The moment UED forces entered the kill zone, every hidden weapons platform came online. The system lit up with weapons fire. Energy lances tore through the formation. Kinetic rounds shredded fighter squadrons before they could react. Incoming fire! The Cerberus rocked violently as ionized flak rounds detonated mid-space, disabling shields on 3 frontline destroyers before they could even return fire. On the Scourge, Seagal's grip tightened. His eyes flicked to the tactical displays, watching as enemy formations moved with ruthless coordination. They hadn't underestimated the net. They had underestimated how far their influence reached. Someone had warned them. All ships evasive, Seagal barked. The UED fleet scrambled, breaking formation. But it was too late for many. A Vanguard-class cruiser, the UED Judicator, took a direct hit to its bridge, its core detonating in a fiery explosion that sent debris scattering across the battlefield. Phalan's voice cracked over the comms. We just lost the Judicator. We are losing ships fast. Wattos gritted his teeth as the Cerberus's hull groaned under the barrage. Sir, we are being boxed in. Seagal's eyes darkened. The net hadn't just set a trap. They had turned the entire battlefield against them. Explosions lit the void, metal torn apart as UED ships struggled to regroup. The net's war fleet pressed their advantage. Their ships moved in coordinated strike patterns, severing escape routes. 5th and 6th battle groups have lost formation, enemy flanking from Vector 7. The bridge shook violently as the Scourge's forward shields flared under impact. Seagal braced against the hollow table as displays flickered under the strain. Full fleet-wide combat formation. Focus fire on their command ships. Missiles streaked across the void, colliding with net battleships, but their shielding was stronger than expected. They had military-grade tech. Another piece of the puzzle slotted into place. This wasn't just a crime syndicate, it was a military force. A voice cut through the chaos, a woman's voice, gritted with determination. This is Commander Tessa Vale of the UED Valkyrie. Forward shields at 12%. We won't hold much longer. Seagal recognized the name, one of their best. Hold your ground, Commander. His voice was firm. Help is coming. She didn't ask how. She just kept fighting. The battle had shifted into brutal close-quarters combat. Destroyers weaved between debris, exchanging relentless broadsides, hulls ripping open to the void. The UED Remnant, a midline battleship, took a direct hit to its lateral thrusters, sending it into an uncontrolled drift. Its hull scraped against an enemy cruiser, triggering emergency collision alarms on both vessels. Structural damage rippled across the impact site, but neither ship was completely disabled. The Remnant fired manoeuvring thrusters, breaking free before sustaining further damage. The Cerberus, leading one of the last coordinated wings, dove low beneath a net battleship, releasing a full spread of torpedoes. Point defense systems intercepted half, but the remaining warheads pierced through the weakened shields, detonating along the armor plating and sending a chain reaction of secondary explosions rippling through the enemy vessel's hull. The net's cruiser buckled, its shields flickering out. But another took its place instantly. Seagal's expression hardened. He had seen impossible odds before, but not like this. They have numbers, he muttered. More than us. Too many. It was becoming clear. They couldn't win this fight by conventional means. Captain Wattos, Commander Ville, Rally your squadrons. We're holding this line, sir, Ville's voice crackled through the static. For how long? Seagal didn't hesitate. As long as it takes. The UED battleship Scourge blazed through the void, its cannons unleashing their final salvos. Despite the heat searing through their barrels, they kept firing. Shields flickered, their integrity crumbling with every brutal impact. The hull groaned under the relentless assault, but still it stood, a fortress of steel, defiant, and sheer human will. The UED was holding, but barely. The Net's dreadnoughts and battle cruisers advanced with relentless momentum, their formations tightening like a noose. The UED had inflicted damage, destroyed ships, but the Net's sheer numbers and prepared defences were taking their toll. A burst of static crackled through the comms. Commander Tessa Vale's strained voice cut through the chaos. Shields at 7%. We're barely keeping it together. Seagal's brow furrowed. They needed time. He turned to his comms officer. Broadcast on all human frequencies. Open transmission. The officer hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Channel open, sir. Seagal stepped forward, his voice calm but weighted with urgency. To all human forces receiving this transmission, this is Admiral Lance Seagal of the United Earth Defence. We are engaged in heavy combat in the Yarrick system. The Net, a slavery coalition who has chained some of our brothers and sisters and thousands of civilians of other species, was waiting for us. We are outnumbered. We are surrounded. The battle outside raged on, but Seagal kept his tone measured. This fight is bigger than us. This isn't just about the UED. It's about what kind of galaxy we live in. If we fall here, they won't stop. They will keep taking, keep enslaving, keep profiting off those too weak to fight back. He took a breath. We will not break, but we need you to. To every UED captain, to every ship that still calls itself human, this is our line. We hold here, or we fall together. Any ship that can make the jump, get here now. The transmission cut. There was nothing more to say. Now it was up to whoever was out there. Then, in a matter of seconds, the console flickered with incoming transmission, one after another. Sir, this is Captain Paul Arcoin of the Giant. Sir, we're coming. Here is Captain Diana Santoro of the Marduk. Wait for us, sir. We will be there. More voices followed, one after another. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. And not the way the Net wanted. Inside the UED Cerberus, Captain Henry Watros watched as the incoming firestorm rained down against their shields. The battle had become a brutal war of attrition, with the Net's fleet pressing closer every second. Carbonell turned to him, face pale but steady. Sir, we just picked up multiple FTL jumps, human signatures. They're coming. Watros didn't react. His grip tightened on the armrest. How long? Carbonell's voice was quieter this time. 30 minutes. A silence stretched through the bridge. Weiss exhaled, his voice heavy. Sir, I don't think we have 10. Watros looked around the bridge, faces coated in sweat, exhaustion setting in. He could see it in their eyes. They knew the reality of the situation. He exhaled slowly, voice calm as iron. We will hold the line. We will hold as long as it takes. We're not dying here. They are. The crew straightened. There was no hesitation. Aye, Captain. The battle raged on. Captain, their flank is shifting. Watros didn't hesitate. Redirect all railgun fire to disrupt their right wing. Across the battlefield, the UED's battered warships fought smarter, not harder. The Cerberus and its escorts weaved through the Net's formation, hitting critical subsystems instead of aiming for raw destruction. Small fighter wings broke off into unpredictable attack patterns, throwing off enemy targeting systems. Damaged UED cruisers fired missile barrages while retreating into friendly lines, forcing the net to waste shots on already disabled ships. Aboard the Scourge, Seagal watched as their fleet refused to break, despite the overwhelming odds. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean. But they were stalling the enemy, making every second count. He turned to his tactical officer. "Deploy decoy flares along grid N. Make them think we're repositioning our rear guard. Force them to adjust." "Aye, sir." Then came the moment they had feared since the battle began. "Sir, the Scourge's shield generators are overloading." Seagal gritted his teeth. "Reroute power from non-essential systems. Already at max. Reroute failing. Shields collapsing." But before Seagal could respond, the forward shields collapsed. Within seconds, enemy fire ripped through the ship's armour, tearing into the lower decks. Explosions rocked the command centre as the bridge flickered with emergency red lighting. "Hull breach on Deck 5. We've lost sections 3A through 3D. Casualty reports incoming." Seagal caught himself against the railing, ignoring the warning klaxons. Then, "FTL signatures inbound." Seagal snapped his head toward the display. For a second, the battlefield held its breath. The hum of systems, the distant crackle of laser fire, the dying flickers of shields. Then, the tactical grid flickered, once, twice, and then the void erupted in blue light. Ships tore out of FTL like thunder cracking through space. First, the Osiris, then the Marduk, then dozens more. The battlefield wasn't empty anymore. The humans had arrived. Seagal's lips curled into a grim smile. They're here. Beyond the battle, space flared with fresh ruptures. Wave after wave of UED warships emerged from slipspace. First came the battle cruisers, their rail cannons already locking onto enemy ships before their jump drives had fully disengaged. Then the smaller corvettes, weaving through debris, launching precision missile strikes against the net's interceptors. A transmission cut through the static. "This is Admiral Adivali Wolga of the Osiris. Sorry we're late to the party." Seagal wiped blood from his forehead and grinned. "Just in time, Admiral. Just in time." Across the battlefield, net commanders froze. Their calculated slaughter had just turned into a desperate retreat. Tactical grids flickered with a horror they couldn't yet admit. The human fleet was larger than they had anticipated. Far larger. For the first time since the battle began, they were the ones trapped. The Scourge's hull still burned, scars of battle etched deep into its armour. Smoke leaked from fractured decks. Metal groaned under relentless strain. But now, the UED was no longer fighting to survive. They were fighting to win. FTL ruptures still flickered in the void as more reinforcements emerged, flooding the war zone with fresh ships and firepower. What had begun as a desperate resistance was now a full-scale counter-offensive. The momentum had shifted, irreversibly. Seagal's tactical display was alive with movement. UED formations consolidated as the net's once coordinated assault crumbled under relentless pressure. The enemy had fought with cunning and preparation, but now they were reacting, breaking, failing. "All ships, advance! Do not let them regroup." His command cut through the fleet-wide comms like a bolt of lightning. The UED responded with precision honed through years of war. The Osiris led the charge, its forward rail batteries firing at full charge, tearing through a net battle cruiser's shields before a coordinated torpedo barrage ripped it apart in a chain reaction. The Mardu, flanking in perfect sync with the Giant, carved into enemy lines, their destroyers shattering formations with ruthless efficiency. The net's fleet was breaking. Some ships tried to hold their ground. Others attempted to flee. But there was no escape. "Sir, their fleet is fragmenting." Watto's voice came through the comms, sharp with understanding. On the net's command channel, intercepted transmissions turned frantic. Overlapping orders, voices cracking under pressure. "Hold formation. Do not break. We're being flanked. We need retreat vectors now, now." It didn't matter. The tide had turned. "Then push harder, Captain. We're finishing this." On the Cerberus, Carbell's console flickered with an incoming transmission. Wattos turned to her. "Put it through." A holographic image of a Vashari commander materialized. His smooth-scaled features were impassive, but his voice carried quiet gravity. "Human Commander, our forces have taken the prison colonies. The chains are broken." Watros exhaled sharply. The war had begun because of those chains. Now they were shattered. There was nothing left to discuss. His response was cold, final. "Good. No survivors, no second chances. We end this now." The transmission cut, and with it, any lingering hesitation vanished. The UED fleet surged forward like a tidal wave, closing in on the final strongholds of the Net's forces. Their flagship, a massive Fortress-class dreadnought, tried to rally its remaining ships, broadcasting commands in a desperate attempt to salvage what little control they had left. It was too late. The Scourge and the Osiris opened fire in tandem, their combined artillery slamming into the enemy warship with enough force to collapse its shielding in seconds. Then, leading the Scourge, Admiral Lance Segal surged into the void, positioning his ship directly in the path of the enemy dreadnought. The Scourge's shields were already gone, its hull scorched and battered. But Segal knew hesitation would only prolong the battle. He had come for this moment. With a single command, the Scourge unleashed everything it had: high-velocity railguns, plasma lances, torpedo volleys, every weapon system firing at full capacity. The Net's flagship staggered, its armour rupturing under the unrelenting assault, its desperate counterfire scattering harmlessly as it lost power piece by piece. Segal stood firm on the bridge, watching as the dreadnought began to break apart, flames bursting from its decks, escape pods launching, only to be caught in the blast radius of secondary explosions. He didn't move, didn't waver. This was what he came for. A final desperate transmission crackled through the Net's frequencies. "We surrender. We surrender." The plea was lost in fire as the Scourge's plasma lance pierced the dreadnought's core. No response came, no mercy was given. The explosion that followed was blinding, sending debris scattering through the void. Across the battlefield, the last remnants of the Net's fleet turned to flee, engines burning as they tried to escape the system, their formations disintegrating as panic set in. But Segal's voice came across the command channels, cold and absolute. "No retreat, no escape. End it." There was no hesitation. UED warships accelerated, targeting engines and FTL drives first, cutting off any chance of retreat. Stragglers were picked off one by one, railguns and torpedoes reducing them to drifting wreckage. The last Net cruiser faltered, its propulsion systems failing. The crew, no doubt realizing their fate as their ship was torn apart by the relentless assault. The Scourge drifted forward, weapons smouldering. No resistance remained. Across the battlefield, the Net's fleet was no more. The void was littered with burning husks of shattered warships, their twisted metal drifting aimlessly. Hulls cracked, atmospheres vented, and lifeless wreckage floated in the cold abyss. There were no distress signals, no survivors. Segal exhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the edge of the hollow table as his eyes locked onto the final target. The Net Station. A massive construct hanging in the void, its surface pitted with scars from years of piracy and subjugation. Surrounded by still active defence platforms, even as the Net's fleet was wiped from existence, their command station still loomed, a remnant of their empire, the last monument to their reign. The Scourge's tactical officer turned from his console, his voice steady despite the exhaustion beneath it. "Sir, the station is locked down. They're sealing blast doors. Internal power fluctuations suggest they're purging data." Segal nodded. They knew what was coming. They weren't trying to escape. They were trying to hide whatever evidence they could before the end. All UED ships, prepare for orbital strike. His voice was quiet, but unshakable. The fleet shifted position, lining up their bombardment solutions, railguns and energy lancers, adjusting their trajectories for maximum impact. A final transmission forced its way onto Seagal's display, static clawing through the signal, but the voice behind it remained defiant. "You think you've won?" A low, guttural chuckle crackled through the interference, weak but mocking. "There will always be another. You cannot kill the demand." Seagal's expression remained still. "Then we'll make them afraid of supplying it." He gestured to his weapons officer. "Fire." The Scourge fired first, its main railgun sending a hypervelocity slug the size of a building directly into the heart of the station. A heartbeat later, the rest of the UED fleet followed, plasma lancers slicing through defense platforms, torpedoes streaking toward vital infrastructure. The station shuddered violently, its hull fracturing as containment breaches erupted across multiple levels. Secondary explosions rippled outward, tearing through docking bays, severing escape routes. The command core detonated, sending a blinding fireball through what remained of the structure.